Our next speaker will be John McLaughlin. He will be talking about a preliminary bryophyte flora of Henry W. Coe State Park. And the funding for that was helped by the Dean W. Taylor Award that we've been giving now for a couple years. So I think that's pretty cool. John is a curator of the bryophytes at San Jose State University. He has a BS in biology from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and now a master's in biological sciences from San Jose State University. Welcome, John.
All right. Yes, well, thank you very much for having me. It's my first symposium here, and I'm already having a blast. And I'll certainly come back in the next 2 years. Let's see. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, perfect. Yes, well, like Linnea said, I recently graduated last spring, finishing this project, so it's no longer preliminary. It's done. I got all the results. And yes, my name is John McLaughlin, and I'll be telling you about that research today titled The Bryophyte Flora of Henry W. Coe State Park. All right, this figure may look familiar, but so I won't be redundant and talk about it again. I think Ben did a great job of describing how important it is and the many things we can get out of this figure. But the main point I want to drive is the fact that a justification for this type of study is that there are many discoveries to be made still here in California and in the West at large for bryophytes. And if this trend continues over the last 50 years, we'll discover more things. So now I can begin to hone in on my study site if we're not familiar with it. So there are many mountain ranges in California. Today we'll be talking about the coast ranges, specifically the southern coast ranges. So in the southern coast ranges, we're going to find ourselves in the Diablo Range. So this range specifically, in terms of research on bryophytes, is very overlooked. Only one other study has been published on bryophyte floristics in the Diablo Range, and that was at the northern part of the range at Mount Diablo State Park in 2021. And so this range spans from Mount Diablo State Park, essentially in the north, all the way down to San Luis Obispo County in the south. And there are three major reasons why this area has been overlooked for bryophytes in the past. So the first reason is that it's very arid. So it's considered an interior coastal range. So it finds itself east of the immediate coast ranges like the Santa Cruz Mountains. And bryologists usually, historically, like areas that are wet. And that's where people think the bryophytes are. But contrary to that, there are plenty of bryophytes, as you'll see later on, in this more arid area. Another reason why it's been overlooked is because the terrain is really rugged and it's rough. And I'll go into that a little later about how difficult it was sometimes to traverse some of the land during the study. And another reason why is that most of this land along the Diablo Range consists of private land. And so getting access to this area, to this range, can be really difficult, and only a few preserves exist. So even smaller subset of the Diablo Range, in which my study site occurs, is called the Mount Hamilton Range. And so this range is interesting for a few reasons. Helen Sharsmith in 1945 wrote a vascular flora for this range. She didn't include any bryophytes, sadly, but for the vascular flora, she found a number of rare and locally endemic species only to this small range. And since then, there has been no at least efforts for bryophytes and a little efforts for floristics in this area. But in 2018, Kling et al. Looked at the conservation priority for vascular plants in California. And would you know it, there is a hotspot for all the three metrics that they looked at: diversification, divergence, and survival, right in the Mount Hamilton Range where my study site occurs. So for all the reasons I described, this justifies and produces an ideal candidate for conducting bryophyte inventories or floristic research in this area. And that leads us to the state park, Henry W. Coe State Park. It's 87,000 acres large, so it's quite large. It's the second largest state park in California, behind Anza Borrego Desert State Park in San Diego. It's about an hour and a half outside of San Jose, California, around 2.5 hours outside of San Francisco. And it spans 2 counties in the west from Santa Clara County all the way to the east in Stanislaus County. And for Santa Clara County, there's been a handful of collections, good historical records there, but mostly on the foothills of the Santa Cruz Mountains, not so much on the eastern side of it. And for Stanislaus County, if you know this county well, it's a really large county. The western side of this county is on the eastern edge of the Diablo Range, and then most of the rest of the county finds itself in the Central Valley. So very, very few bryophytes have been collected from this county. So quickly about the history and the land use. So long before Western settlers came, there was the North Yakut Valley tribe, and the Ohlone people roamed these areas, Henrico State Park, for foraging and for hunting. And there's some remnants of that still there today. Following that, Western settlers came, staked their claim. This is where they had mines, orchards, farms, and ranch land. And then the daughter of Henry W. Coe, who was a very prominent rancher on these lands, her name is Seda Coe. She donated the first plot of land, her father's ranch, to Santa Clara County, specifically as a refuge for the people of the Bay Area to come visit and reflect on nature. And since then, eventually the land was donated to the state, and new additions have been added over the years, all totaling in the 87,000 acres that are today, and new additions are being added still now. So quickly on the vascular plant communities. So it's largely in the park. You have foothill woodlands, riparian woodlands, and chaparral, as well as we have some non-native grasslands. These are general overviews of the communities in the park, but of course there are much more detailed variations. The geology of the park can be quite interesting. It's largely a Franciscan complex where we have minerals including conglomerate outcrops, sandstone outcrops, and blue schist. There's a thin strip of ultramafic substrate in the park on the western side, and this area was comprehensively inventoried. Specifically, as we know that this can be a driver for plant diversity and evolution. Not seen on this geologic map is some areas of the park that are dotted with volcanic minerals. So that includes Burra Burra Peak and Hat Rock Peak, which were also comprehensively inventoried, as volcanic substrates are known to have some interesting bryophytes. So Henry W. Coe State Park is no stranger to wildfires. Over the last 20 years, there are 2 major wildfires that came through the park. The most recent was the SCU Lightning Complex fire in 2020. And this burned around 50,000 acres of the park in the eastern side. But you can see, the land is still recovering, but you'll see some pictures that it's recovering well. And overall, it's been a good thing for the park. So the collection history for bryophytes, that is very, very little historically. The first record of bryophytes, collection for bryophytes in the park was in 1993 by Alan Whittemore. And Alan Whittemore and his colleague, W. Briggs, their hope was to do my study and to do a flora for the park. Alan's a well-known bryologist in the Bay Area. But sadly, they weren't able to complete the project. And it fell through. And then since 1993, various other collectors would find themselves in the park and pick up a few things here and there. So before my study began, it all totaled around 186 vouchers, and which equaled 90 species. So the objective of my study was to comprehensively inventory the bryophytes of the state park with a focus on diversity, distribution, and conservation implications. But for today's talk, I'll mostly be talking about diversity due to time constraints. So about the methods. So I took around 32 field trips over 3 years to the state park. So this involved hiking, doing day hikes, doing backpacking trips and camping trips, overnight trips, as well as doing lots of driving in the park. And if you've ever been or driven in the park or known someone who's been there, the roads are rough. And I can say that luckily I only got stuck once, so we made it off pretty unscathed. And so yeah, once we're collecting the bryophytes in the field, we take them back to the lab. We'll put a temporary label on them, and then we'll start to work on identifying these bryophytes. And with bryophytes, you need microscopy to get to species level. And so through many, many hours of microscopy, we eventually get to a name. And if you don't get to a name, or if we're not sure about it, we'll send it to an expert, and I'll acknowledge them later on. We'll put it in a permanent packet with a permanent label. And so all of the specimens now are housed at the California Academy of Sciences, with the duplicates of some of the specimens, around 300 or 400 specimens are now at the UC Davis Herbarium. And all the data is publicly available on the Symbiota portals and the Bryophyte portal. All right, now we can talk about results. So looking at the map to the right, this is a map of the state park. There's two portions of the map and two portions of the park as a whole. So the darker gray is the main part of the park, and this is the Santa Clara County side of the park. And the lighter gray to the northeast is the Aristaba Wilderness, and this is the Stanislaus side of the park. And so the pink dots represent the historical records, and then the blue dots represent the area we covered during my study. And so the goal was really to maximize coverage. You know, the park is huge, so we couldn't, in the time I had, and I wanted to graduate, I could only do so much. And so yeah, we tried our best to get to as many areas of the park. Certainly, the most interesting landmark regions of the park, certain geologic formations, as well as other waterways and watershed areas. So the collections to date, if you remember that number I said earlier, it was 180 collections, and now we've raised that number to 1,500. So we have a really much better view and understanding of what species exist here, and the count is almost doubled to 177 species. This is roughly 22% of what we know of California's bryophyte diversity. This includes 91 county records, so a lot of that comes from Stanislaus County, like I said earlier. There's nothing there, so many common things we just added, and we knew they were there, we just didn't have a voucher for them. And then we also had 3 tentatively undescribed species from the park. So breaking it down by phylum, there's 153 mosses in the park, and here's a few examples of those. I'll let you look at those for a second. And then for the liverworts and the hornworts, there's 20 liverwort species here and 4 hornwort species. I guess the number is debatable for the hornworts. It can be either 6 or 8, like Ben said, but 4 doesn't seem like a lot, but it is a lot for hornworts, and it represents, give or take, about half of the hornworts we know from California, including range extension for the Phaeoceras proscauri, a recently described endemic hornwort of California. It was described from Monterey County, and this marks its easternmost range in California. And then for the liverworts, we have a nice diversity, with the Ricciaceae, the members being on the bottom right of this slide here, being the most diverse with 7 species, including the aquatic Riccicarpus natans. So species richness by family. So these are the 3 most species-rich families in the park. So the first is Proteaceae. So no surprises here. Proteaceae is this most species-rich family in California as a whole, so no surprises there. With 45 species, this includes a number of our uncommon species in California and within the area. Also, it includes many of our ephemeral and kind of spring annual species, so some things that are really, really tiny and hard to find sometimes. And another note to say is that the 2 first years that I conducted this study in the park were kind of drought years. It was only the 3rd year where we had a really good wet rain season and made a push to go out and collecting that year. And so this family could definitely hold lots of diversity that we don't know about yet, because we're waiting on good rain years to have these kind of ephemerals to pop up. So the second most diverse family is the Bryophyte family. So this family is interesting for a number of reasons. So first of all, Ben mentioned talking about we don't think of bryophytes as being introduced or non-native. But around 5 species, so a little more than half of the recognized non-native bryophytes in the study area are in this family, most of them originating from Europe. Also, an interesting fact about this family is that a number of recently described taxa are in this Bryaceae family, and many of those taxa are actually common, almost abundant in the park, such as the one represented by F in this plate here, Gemmabrium binosum. It's one of my favorites. It's very pretty. And then the three tentatively undescribed species are also fall in this family. And that is, one of those is E here, Plagiobryotes species or Tychosum species. It's still undescribed. And then lastly, the third most species-rich family in the park is Brachythiaceae. And so no big surprises here. It's not a super diverse group, but we have all of the Scleropodium species. We certainly have the Homalithecium species that Lark talked about earlier on, and it was really great to go out with her. She volunteered a few times to come out with me into the field, and it was great to get that inside knowledge on Homalithecium from her. And then definitely the most uncommon species in this family is kind of restricted to the deepest and most wet canyons is Brachythiaceum frigidum, which we only collected maybe once or twice within the study. So to kind of summarize the species accumulation over time within the park, we see the historical collections from 1993 to 2020, and then my study that ranged from 2021 to 2023. You can see that there still is an upward trend for species accumulation over time. And so, as with many scientific studies, it is technically preliminary. There's still much more species I'm sure we can find out there and add to the species list. But like I said, I have to graduate. So maybe come back in 20 years and we can go at it again. So there were a number of noteworthy records from the park. I'm just going to name a few here. So there's a special status species, Plagiobryotes binocula, that we collected actually a few times, both in the Stanislaus side of the state park and the Santa Clara part. Gotcha. Aloina rigida, new to the state, and then the 3 undescribed species. So here's a summary of those important records. The different county records, new to the whole range, rare from California, less than 10 species, introduced and listed. And then quickly, I want to talk about one interesting species that's undescribed, and it's near and dear to me because I'm working on some molecular work to hopefully resolve it. So this is our dichotomum, or species, Bryum species 1. It's part of the dichotomum complex. And this species is morphologically unique from any species we have here in California. And it has these really, really large, well-produced, well-developed axillary bulbils. And you can see them in this picture circled in red. The only issue we have with this species is that there is a species in Europe called Bryum differenensis that also has very large and very similar looking bulbils, and so that's why we're hoping this molecular work will help resolve it. So our big takeaways from this is that bryophytes are understudied organisms, and this is a very much understudied region in California. There are some really good candidates for if people want to get into bryology and do a study like mine. Areas of the Diablo Range that would really benefit from a inventory, such as San Benito, Pacheco State Park, and the Pinnacles need a proper published flora as well. We had many new discoveries and many new discoveries to come in California and in this area. And now Henry Co. marks the most diverse region in the Diablo Range for bryophytes. Thank you for all my funders, mentors, colleagues, and people that helped me identify some of the more difficult bryophytes. And I can now take your questions. Thank you. Oh, we got one over there, I think.
So I was wondering if you did any of your collections in the area that burned in 2020.
Mm-hmm. So what about the collections in the burned area?
Did you do collections in the burned area? Because I'm thinking that you could monitor over time, or somebody could monitor over time, what recovery looked like.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And, well, bryophytes are integral in burn recovery. One moss that kind of covers these lands, and it's quite homogeneous after the really bad burns, is Funaria hygrometrica. And so that is going to be the dominant bryophyte you see and that we saw in the burned areas. But that's not to say that there weren't bryophytes elsewhere. Especially a lot of the riparian areas and riparian corridors in these burned regions had little niches and areas that were protected from the fires. And so there were interesting collections that were made in areas that were severely burned, but in protected sites underneath rocks or in crevices and things near where water is flowing. So yeah, and that's another thing too, is that in 20 years, hopefully there will be no more fires there, and it'd be good it'd be good to get a better view of these burned areas where once the land is recovered and we can see what really is out there. All right, one more question, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. And in the back, I think.
Hi. Forgive my ignorance with bryophytes, but I just wanted to know if it all comes down to microscopy. As someone who I'm starting to think more about in floristic surveys, that I need to start paying better attention to bryophytes, how do you determine when you're done collecting and that you've grabbed everything that could be out there? Like, how does one even begin to make that determination?
Yes, I think it's difficult to impossible to feel 100% confident in that. And so I can relate to your struggle, absolutely. You do your best, and there's a term we use in bryology called hay baling. I've heard it used many times before. But just scoop up everything you can and get it in packets, and then you do your best. So I completely relate. And especially in Mediterranean climates too, it's important to come back during the wet season. And during different months within the year, as things do have different phenology for bryophytes. The things are reproducing their capsules at different times of the year, and so that's another important thing to look at, is revisiting areas at different times of the year. All right, stop. That's my cue. Thank you very much.